The forest was silent, eerily so. Towering trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the gray morning sky. Damp earth squelched beneath Emily's bare, blistered feet as she staggered forward, her breaths shallow and ragged. Her once white maternity dress was now torn and stained with mud, blood, and pine needles. The forest floor was uneven, littered with roots and stones that made every step feel like a cruel test of her will to survive. Her arms wrapped protectively around her swollen belly, as if shielding her unborn child from the malevolence that seemed to breathe through the woods. She winced with every contraction of pain, some from exhaustion, others from fear. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the sickening realization that she was completely alone. Emily didn't know how long she had been wandering, hours, maybe days. Time had become meaningless. Hunger gnawed at her, and dehydration made her tongue feel like sandpaper in her mouth. But it was the betrayal that haunted her more than the physical pain. The man who promised to love and protect her had driven her into this forest, left her without a word, without a weapon, without hope. She hadn't wanted to believe it at first. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd gone for help. But as the sun set on the first day and no one came, the illusion shattered. A glint of something metallic caught her eye, a broken watch lying in the dirt, familiar. Daniel's watch. Panic surged in her chest. Was it a sign, a mistake, or a message? She didn't know anymore. The forest seemed to be watching her, holding secrets in every shadow. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the ground with a soft cry. The pain was overwhelming, radiating from her legs, her spine, her heart. She reached for a nearby tree trunk, for support, but collapsed fully, her face pressing into the cold moss. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she gasped a single word. "Daniel." And then, darkness. The wind whispered through the leaves above her, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The forest had swallowed her whole, but deep in the distance, a pair of eyes watched. And the story was only just beginning. Before the forest, before the fear, before everything unraveled, Emily was happy, or at least she believed she was. Her life in Charleston had always been modest. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, Emily learned the value of resilience early. She worked at a local art gallery, managed community events on weekends, and spent evenings curled up with sketchbooks and warm tea. She wasn't wealthy, but she was content. Everything changed the day Daniel Walker walked into her life. He was unlike anyone she'd ever met. Sharp suit, confident stride, and the kind of smile that disarmed you before you even realized you were falling. He came into the gallery during a private exhibit, looking for a piece with soul, as he put it. Emily guided him through the collection, and by the end of the evening, they were drinking wine and laughing like old friends. He bought 3 paintings and asked for her number without hesitation. Daniel was a tech entrepreneur, self-made, articulate, and strikingly handsome. Emily was drawn in, not just by his wealth, but by the way he listened. He made her feel seen. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Lavish dinners, spontaneous weekend trips, romantic gestures straight out of a novel. It was a whirlwind, and she didn't resist it. Why would she? They were married within 7 months. At first, it felt like a dream. Daniel moved Emily into his lakeside estate. Modern, elegant, sterile. He encouraged her to quit her job and focus on her passions. For a while, she did. She painted, hosted dinners, planned to travel, but then little things began to shift. Daniel started disappearing for long stretches without much explanation. Business trips that came out of nowhere, late-night calls in hushed tones. He became possessive, subtly but persistently. He didn't like her seeing her old friends much. He once deleted a text from her college roommate before she could read it, brushing it off as junk. When she questioned him, he always turned it around. "You don't trust me?" he'd ask, feigning hurt. And Emily, afraid to disrupt the perfection she thought she'd found, would apologize. The mansion became quieter. Daniel's warmth turned to chill at times, but he never hit her, never yelled. The control was silent, wrapped in luxury and false affection. Then came the news that changed everything. She found out she was pregnant on a rainy Thursday morning. Her hands trembled as she held the test in the bathroom mirror. She wasn't scared. She was ecstatic. She imagined telling Daniel over dinner, seeing that crooked grin light up his face, maybe even tears. But that's not how it happened. When she told him, his expression didn't shift. He stared at her for a long moment, then quietly said, "We weren't trying, Emily." No smile, no hug, just silence. He didn't speak much for the rest of the night. The next few days were strange. He alternated between distant and overly attentive. He brought her flowers but refused to talk about baby names. He called a contractor to renovate a guest room, then canceled it days later. One night, she woke up to find him sitting in the dark, living room, staring out the window. When she asked what was wrong, he said only, "This wasn't the plan." It chilled her. Still, she tried to stay hopeful. Maybe he was just overwhelmed. She reminded herself of the man who once painted her, name in the sand during a beach getaway. The man who held her hand during fireworks, who said she was the first woman he ever truly trusted. But even as she clung to those memories, doubt grew like ivy in her heart. She started noticing locked drawers in his office, whispered phone calls, in languages she didn't recognize, and a strange man who seemed to watch their house from a parked car down the street. When she asked Daniel, he brushed it off again. "Paranoia," he called it, kissing her forehead. Then came the cabin trip. He suggested a weekend getaway to clear their heads, promising no phones, no interruptions, just them and nature. Emily hesitated. Something didn't feel right. But Daniel had already packed the bags, already booked the place. "It'll be good for us," he said. So she agreed. Looking back, she hated how easily she said yes. How much she still wanted to believe in the man she married, even when the truth had already begun to bleed through the cracks. She didn't know it then, but that trip would shatter everything. And in the silence of the trees, far from the city, far from help, Daniel would reveal who he truly was. Not a husband, not a protector, but something far, far darker. The weekend had been Daniel's idea. After weeks of emotional distance, silent dinners, and fleeting glances, he came to her one morning with a bright smile and a brochure for a remote mountain cabin. "Let's get away, just the two of us," he said, brushing her hair back like he used to. "No phones, no distractions, just peace. You need rest, Em. The baby needs calm." She wanted to believe this was his way of reconnecting, of recommitting. Maybe the news of the pregnancy had simply overwhelmed him. Maybe this trip was the turning point. So she packed a small suitcase, tucked in her prenatal vitamins, a couple of her favorite sketchbooks, and let herself hope. They drove for hours, winding up into the Appalachian Mountains, where cell signals flickered and eventually disappeared altogether. Daniel's mood seemed lighter than it had in weeks. He hummed to the radio, stole glances at her belly with an unreadable expression, and even made jokes that almost made her laugh. For a few brief moments, the dream of a happy family flickered again. The cabin itself was tucked deep into a thicket of evergreens and moss-covered rocks. It was picturesque, in a haunting kind of way. Wooden beams aged to gray, windows that stared like blank eyes into the woods, and the faint smell of pine and old smoke. There were no neighbors in sight. No paved roads, no emergency numbers listed on the old landline, which Daniel quickly unplugged, saying, "We don't need distractions." Still, Emily smiled and tried to push down the unease growing in her chest. The first night passed quietly. They ate a simple dinner by the fire, drank tea, and watched the flames dance. Daniel pulled her close and stroked her belly as if nothing had ever gone wrong between them. He kissed her forehead, told her he loved her. She wanted to believe it. She had to believe it. But something felt off. His affection felt scripted, timed. That night, she had trouble sleeping. The forest was too quiet. Even the crickets seemed muted. She thought she heard whispers outside the cabin, but every time she got up to look, there was nothing. In the morning, the illusion shattered. She woke in a cold bed, alone. Daniel's side was empty. At first, she thought he'd gone to fetch firewood or take a walk, but when she shuffled out of bed and opened the door, she was met with a locked latch from the outside. Confused, she jiggled the knob, then pounded. "Daniel?" she called. No answer. She moved to the window and pushed it open. Cool forest air hit her face. The driveway was empty. His black Range Rover was gone. Panic clawed at her throat as she rushed to the back door, also locked. There were no notes, no keys, no phone service. Nothing. She stood frozen in the middle of the living room, heart pounding, stomach twisting. "Daniel!" she screamed again. Silence. Just the whisper of the wind through the trees. It didn't make sense. Why would he leave? Her here? Alone? Pregnant? Was he hurt? Was this some kind of sick prank? She began tearing through the cabin, opening cabinets, checking drawers, looking for a note, a clue. But the place had been cleared out of anything useful. Even the pantry was suspiciously empty. There was no map, no compass, just a firewood pile, a broken lantern, and an old axe head with no handle. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't a mistake. She had been left here. On purpose. The tears came fast. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her belly, sobbing into the dusty wood. Betrayal doesn't feel like a sharp stab. It feels like a slow bleed. Numbing of the senses. Her husband had abandoned her, left her to die, possibly. Alone, pregnant, miles from anyone. And still, she couldn't understand why. Why would he do this? Was the baby too much? Did he never love her to begin with? The pain of those questions pressed down on her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. But after hours curled in grief, something shifted inside her, a flicker of instinct. The baby kicked, just once, but enough to remind her she wasn't completely alone. She had someone to fight for. Wiping her face, Emily stood. Her legs were shaky, her body sore, but her eyes had hardened. She pulled on a thick blanket from the bed, tore a strip of cloth from the curtain to wrap her feet, and opened the window wider. If Daniel had left her here to disappear, to die, he had underestimated her resolve. She was going to survive, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. And if she made it out of these woods, Daniel would pay for everything. The first night in the forest was the hardest. The cold seeped into Emily's bones, wrapping around her like icy fingers. Her makeshift shoes, just torn curtain fabric, were no match for the rough terrain. She had managed to escape through the cabin's side window, but the steep drop left her limping with each step. Every noise, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, sent waves of panic through her. She was alone, scared, and far from civilization. But she couldn't afford to stop. Her body ached, her lips cracked from dehydration, and her stomach growled relentlessly. Each breath felt heavier than the last. She knew she needed water, food, shelter, anything to keep her going. But she pressed forward, hand on her swollen belly, whispering softly to the life growing inside her. "We'll get out of here," she murmured, more a prayer than a promise. The days blurred together. Emily moved slowly, methodically. During daylight, she followed the sun, hoping it would lead her somewhere, anywhere, She drank rainwater off leaves and tried nibbling on wild berries, though most were too bitter or unfamiliar. Hunger hollowed her out from the inside, and sleep came in short, restless bursts beneath trees and overgrown brush. Her body weakened, but her mind remained focused. It was during one of these restless nights, curled beneath a fallen tree, that she remembered something: her father's voice. He had been a park ranger in Oregon before he died when she was just a teen. He used to take her camping, teaching her how to find moss to locate north, which plants were poisonous, and how to make shelter from branches and bark. She clung to those memories now like lifelines. Her father's voice echoed in her ears. Don't ever panic. The woods will feel bigger when you're scared, but they're still just woods. Using what little strength she had, Emily fashioned crude shelter from branches, used stones to collect rainwater, and kept moving. Every step was agony, her body failing under the strain of survival and pregnancy. She began talking to her baby more, telling stories, singing softly, just to keep her mind sharp. On the fourth day, delirious from exhaustion, she saw something in the distance. At first, she thought it was a hallucination, a shape hidden beneath thick vines and fallen leaves, wooden, rectangular, and sun-bleached. A structure. Emily forced herself to keep going, stumbling and crawling until she reached it, an old ranger's shed. The paint was chipped and the lock rusted, but she broke in with a stone. Inside, the air was stale but dry. Rusty tools lined the walls, and a long-dead radio sat on a table. But there was an old tarp she used as a blanket and a half-empty bottle of iodine tablets. Someone had been here before. She collapsed inside, too weak to move further, heart pounding faintly in her chest. Her breathing slowed. Consciousness flickered. She didn't know if she was dying or dreaming. Then, voices, muffled, distant. Footsteps outside. Her eyes fluttered open. She tried to call out, but only a raspy breath escaped. The door creaked, and two figures appeared. Hikers, backpacks slung over their shoulders, faces shocked as they took in the sight of a gaunt, pregnant woman lying in the corner of the shed. "She's alive!" one of them shouted. The other dropped to his knees, pulling out a satellite phone. That was the last thing she remembered. When she woke up, she was surrounded by white hospital walls, fluorescent lights, the steady beep of machines. An oxygen mask covered her face, and a nurse gently whispered that she was safe. Emily's body was severely dehydrated. She had lost nearly 10 pounds in the forest. Her blood pressure had plummeted, and her baby's heartbeat had slowed dangerously. But somehow both of them had survived. Doctors called her recovery a miracle. But the questions began almost immediately. How had a pregnant woman ended up in such a remote part of the woods with no supplies, no ID, no transportation? Why did she have bruises on her arms and scratches down her legs? Why did she keep whispering? The same name in her sleep? Daniel? Hospital staff notified the authorities. A detective arrived the next morning, notebook in hand, eyes sharp. Emily was still weak, barely able to speak, but her story was enough to trigger alarm bells. Something wasn't right. Something didn't add up. And as she drifted back into a medicated sleep, unaware that the FBI would soon be notified, a quiet truth settled in the room. This was no accident. Someone had tried to erase her. Detective Laura Monroe had been on the force for nearly 15 years, but the moment she read the preliminary report about the woman found half dead in the woods, something told her this case would be different. A pregnant woman, disoriented and starving, discovered in a collapsed ranger's shed with no ID, no supplies, and no clue how she got there. It wasn't just suspicious, it was chilling. Monroe visited the hospital first, where Emily was recovering slowly but steadily. She was pale, frail, but alert. Her voice cracked as she recounted everything she remembered: Daniel's sudden detachment, the cabin in the woods, waking up, alone, the hike through the forest. Monroe listened carefully, taking notes and observing every detail. Emily's terror was real, her confusion genuine. When Monroe ran a routine background check on Daniel Walker, she expected a clean record. He was, after all, a well-known businessman with a spotless public image. Instead, the search returned several flagged anomalies. Daniel's business tax ID was linked to 3 separate shell companies. One of them had been under quiet federal scrutiny for nearly a year, suspected in a major wire fraud investigation involving stolen digital assets and cryptocurrency laundering. And that was just the start. Monroe contacted her supervisor. Within 24 hours, the FBI's white-collar crimes division had stepped in and quickly realized it wasn't just white-collar crime they were dealing with. Daniel Walker wasn't just a tech millionaire. He was a chameleon, an identity-hopping operator tied to an international criminal web. According to the Bureau's preliminary findings, he had used at least 4 aliases across different states, and 2 of his companies had quietly funneled money to offshore accounts connected to Eastern European entities suspected of trafficking and cybercrime. The man Emily had married was not who he claimed to be. He was a ghost wrapped in charm. Agents poured into Charleston, setting up temporary operations in a federal field office. Monroe, now working as the local liaison, briefed them on everything Emily had shared. Her testimony was the first concrete clue tying Daniel to something more sinister than financial fraud. Then came the breakthroughs. Daniel's car was found abandoned at a private airfield 2 towns over, its GPS tracker revealing the route he had taken after dropping Emily at the cabin. It led straight to a private hangar. Surveillance footage showed Daniel calmly walking across the tarmac and boarding a small chartered plane. Destination unknown. Inside the car, agents found more disturbing clues: burner phones, a forged passport under the name Elias Monroe, and a flash drive containing encrypted banking data. One account, when cracked, showed 1.8 million transferred offshore the morning after he vanished. And then there was the letter, unsent, folded neatly in the glove box, addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." It read like a suicide note. A fabricated confession, Daniel's final performance. "I've made mistakes," it said. "This world isn't safe for Emily and the baby. They're better off without me." But to investigators, it was clear. This was a cover-up, an alibi, a staged disappearance. Emily wasn't supposed to survive. She was a liability. When the FBI interviewed Emily again, they asked hard questions about Daniel's behaviors, the people he met with, odd phone calls, names she may have overheard. She told them everything she could remember, but what haunted her the most was his face the night before he left her. The way he looked at her belly, cold, final. It hadn't been love, it had been calculation. "He told me the cabin would be good for us," Emily said, her voice shaking. "He packed everything. He even brought my vitamins. I think he wanted to make sure the baby would last just long enough, so it wouldn't look suspicious." The realization broke her again. He hadn't just abandoned her, he had planned her death. Carefully, thoroughly, but he hadn't accounted for one thing: her will to live. The Bureau issued a nationwide bolo, "Be on the lookout," for Daniel Walker, a.k.a. Elias Monroe, a.k.a. Jacob Wyatt. They coordinated with Interpol, alerting international airports. The flash drive's banking information tied him to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Dubai. This was no runaway husband. This was a high-value fugitive. A multi-state manhunt began, with agents stationed at regional airfields, border checkpoints, and financial institutions. His face was distributed discreetly through internal channels. News of Emily's story hadn't broken publicly yet. Investigators were trying to keep it that way to avoid tipping Daniel off. But it was only a matter of time. FBI profiler Kayla Jensen reviewed Daniel's psychological profile. He was a manipulator, a master of deceit, but his weakness was control. He needed to orchestrate everything, which meant he'd likely try to resurface, to check if his plan had worked. That gave them hope. Emily, meanwhile, remained in federal protection at the hospital under an alias. Her health stabilized, but she wasn't the same. She no longer cried when Daniel's name was mentioned. Her grief had burned down to something colder, something resolute. "He tried to erase me," she told Agent Jensen quietly. "Now I'll help you erase him." And with that, she became the FBI's most valuable witness. Not just a survivor, but the key to unraveling one of the most sophisticated deception networks in recent history. The more the FBI uncovered, the clearer it became. Daniel Walker was nothing more than a mask, one of many worn by a man whose real identity was still buried beneath layers of lies. As agents delved deeper into his past, the illusion of the charismatic tech millionaire shattered completely. His real name? Unknown. But aliases traced back nearly a decade. Elias Monroe, Jacob Wyatt, Marcus Delaney, each identity tied to a separate business, each business a fraud. The FBI's Forensic Financial Unit discovered that Daniel had been orchestrating elaborate investment scams. His most notorious technique, presenting himself as a visionary startup founder with exclusive access to cutting-edge tech, biotech, blockchain, renewable energy, whatever trend was hot. He courted wealthy investors at elite galas and industry summits, promising massive returns, and he delivered at first, enough to hook them, but the profits were part of the con, classic Ponzi style. Early returns were paid from the investments of newer victims. Once the scheme reached its saturation point, Daniel vanished, liquidating accounts, wiping devices, and abandoning identities like old clothes. The shell companies used in these schemes were registered across multiple states and countries: Delaware, Nevada, the British Virgin Islands. In each, he used forged documents and synthetic IDs, fabricated from real Social Security numbers stolen from deceased individuals. His network was massive, said Agent Kayla Jensen, reviewing the data on a digital board cluttered with names, pins, and red strings. But it wasn't just financial fraud. Some of these companies were laundering money for larger operations, drug trafficking, even human exploitation rings overseas. Daniel wasn't just a scammer. He was a gear in something much larger and darker. Former associates, now aware of the investigation, began coming forward, some voluntarily, others in exchange for immunity. One, a man named Victor Brandt, recalled working with Daniel during the early stages of a supposed cybersecurity firm based in Berlin. He was smooth, Victor admitted. Knew how to read people, how to play to your ego. I thought he was a genius. Turns out he was stealing code, redirecting funds, and using our offices as a front for cash drops. Another woman, Sierra Vega, had briefly dated him under the alias Marcus Delaney. She claimed he funded their lifestyle with money from venture capital meetings, but never brought her to any of them. He was charming, generous, but never vulnerable, she said. He never talked about his past. If I asked too many questions, he'd shut down or distract me with a vacation. All painted a picture of a man who didn't just lie. He performed. Every identity he created was tailored to a purpose: trust, access, profit. Emily, in this context, was never his future. She was a piece of camouflage. Flashbacks peppered the FBI's internal timeline of events. Emily, wide-eyed and smitten, met Daniel at a charity gala. He'd posed as a philanthropist with a heart for children's hospitals. Their chemistry was instant. He sent flowers, love letters, made grand gestures. To Emily, it felt like fate. To Daniel, it was just another successful recruitment. Every moment of affection was tactical, every compliment rehearsed. When Emily moved in, he already had multiple exits prepared: offshore accounts, burner phones, pre-filled passports. She noticed him taking calls in private, locking his briefcase, disappearing on business trips, but she chalked it up to stress, to pressure. She had loved him too much to believe anything darker. The pregnancy, the FBI concluded, was the crack in Daniel's plan. Fatherhood wasn't part of the script. A child meant permanence, accountability, vulnerability. It tied him to a person, a life he couldn't control with charm or manipulation. And so, he recalibrated. He needed Emily gone, but not murdered. That would invite too much heat. Instead, he orchestrated her disappearance, an accidental tragedy in the woods, a grieving husband who would mourn briefly before vanishing, himself. But she survived, and now his entire empire, carefully built across years, was unraveling. "I think she was just a tool," Agent Jensen said to her team. "A prop for his image. He used her to appear stable, grounded, but she was never meant to make it out of those woods." The realization haunted everyone involved. For Emily, the truth was worse than betrayal. It was erasure. She wasn't just discarded. She was never considered essential in the first place. She had loved a man who viewed her as an accessory, a liability. And yet, despite his calculated coldness, she had survived. She had broken his illusion. Meanwhile, Daniel remained, at large, but the net was tightening. His assets were frozen. Every known associate was flagged. And for the first time in years, his face, real or otherwise, was being studied by professionals trained to spot the smallest inconsistencies. Emily, now under 24-hour protection, was briefed on what had been uncovered. Her silence lasted a long time after. Then she asked just one question. If he's been hiding this long, how do we catch someone who never really existed? The room fell quiet, because that was the challenge. Daniel Walker was dead. But somewhere out there, the man behind the mask was already becoming someone new. The man known as Daniel Walker had always believed he was untouchable. He planned for every variable, predicted every reaction. But what he didn't anticipate was Emily's survival, or the relentless reach of the FBI once they realized who they were really chasing. The hunt had gone international. FBI analysts worked around the clock, triangulating pings from Daniel's burner phones. Though he had ditched most of his electronics, one device, used only once to access a cryptocurrency wallet, led agents to a signal in southern Spain, near the port city of Malaga. Surveillance footage from a private resort confirmed their suspicion. A man matching Daniel's height, build, and posture was caught walking along a beachside promenade, wearing sunglasses and a linen shirt, arm around a woman, but there was more. Financial analysts traced a string of transactions tied to an offshore trust Daniel had failed to close, one that made a single payment to a high-end real estate agency in Tangier, Morocco. Under a new alias Stephen Cross, he had secured a temporary villa just outside the city walls. The agents coordinated with Interpol and local authorities. Timing was critical. Daniel had a pattern: 3 months in one location before disappearing again. And according to the last flight plan he filed under a new identity, he was preparing to leave for Turkey the next morning. It was now or never. Back in the U.S., Emily sat in a secure apartment under federal protection, her hands trembling as she watched the investigation unfold in real time. She wasn't allowed access to classified updates, but Agent Kayla Jensen gave her just enough to keep her grounded. "He's close," she whispered one evening. "We've got eyes on him. He won't get away." And then it happened. At 6:47 a.m. local time in Morocco, with dawn rising over the city's ancient rooftops, a convoy of black vehicles pulled up to a luxury villa. Plainclothes agents stormed the property. Inside, Daniel was packing: passport, cash, flash drives. The exit plan was already underway. He heard the vehicles before he saw them. He made it to the back courtyard, scaled a wall barefoot, desperate, breath heaving. He ran through a neighboring alley, only to be tackled to the ground by 2 Moroccan police officers stationed ahead. As they rolled him over, Daniel didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just smiled. "I was wondering when you'd catch up," he muttered. News of the capture broke within hours. Every major outlet had the headline, "Fugitive Millionaire Caught in Morocco. FBI Confirms Identity of Daniel Walker." Emily watched it all from the couch, eyes locked on the TV. The image was unmistakable. Daniel, wrists cuffed, being led through a gauntlet of cameras. His hair was longer, face leaner, but the arrogance hadn't faded. Her throat tightened. It wasn't relief. Not exactly. It was something deeper, the collision of justice and unresolved trauma. He was no longer a phantom, no longer a mystery. He was real, tangible, captured. "I thought I'd feel free," she whispered to Jensen, who stood silently beside her. "But it's not that simple, is it?" "No," Jensen replied. "It never is." Daniel was extradited within days and flown back to the U.S. under heavy security. Dozens of charges awaited him: fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, attempted manslaughter. His trial would be one of the most high-profile white-collar cases in years. Emily was listed as the government's key witness, but for now, she just sat quietly, watching the screen as the man who had tried to erase her was finally placed behind bars. He had rewritten his identity over and over, but this time, the story wasn't his to tell. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, law enforcement, victims, and onlookers filled every seat, all waiting for the moment when Daniel Walker, formerly a phantom millionaire, would finally face the consequences of his actions, charged with multiple felonies including wire fraud, money laundering, and most shockingly, attempted murder. Daniel stood at the defendant's table, his confident smirk replaced by a tense, guarded expression. The man who once controlled every room now felt the weight of the law closing in. When Emily took the stand, the air shifted. She was calm but resolute, her gaze steady as she recounted the harrowing story, how Daniel had abandoned her in the woods while she was pregnant, the emotional and physical torment she endured, and the betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Her testimony was powerful and raw. The jury listened intently as she detailed Daniel's manipulations, the lies that masked his true identity, and the cold calculation behind his attempt to erase her existence. During cross-examination, Daniel tried to charm and intimidate, leaning forward to whisper false apologies, casting doubt on her memory, even trying to claim she had fabricated the whole story for sympathy. But Emily stood firm. His tricks no longer worked on her. The woman he once controlled had transformed into the strongest version of herself, unbreakable and unyielding. When the jury returned with their verdict, silence fell over the courtroom. Guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence was swift and severe, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, Emily felt a complex wave of emotions, relief, sorrow, and a quiet strength. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. For Emily, this was not just an end, it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild her life and protect the child she had fought so hard to save. Months had passed since the courtroom verdict, and Emily sat quietly in the softly lit hospital room, cradling her newborn son. His tiny fingers curled around hers with an instinctual grip that filled her with a profound sense of hope and renewal. The journey to this moment had been fraught with pain, betrayal, and unimaginable fear, but now, here was proof of her survival, a new life she would fiercely protect. Emily's recovery extended beyond the physical. She began regular therapy sessions with a compassionate counselor who helped her untangle the trauma Daniel had left behind. Each session was a step toward reclaiming her sense of self, a journey through grief, anger, and finally, acceptance. Writing became a sanctuary. She started drafting a memoir, chronicling her story not just as a victim, but as a survivor who had faced darkness and emerged stronger. The community rallied around her, too. Support groups, friends, and even strangers reached out with words of encouragement, donations, and offers to help. Emily found comfort in these connections, realizing that while Daniel had tried to isolate her, she was anything but alone. Her story inspired others to speak out, to seek help, and to stand tall against injustice. Though she often thought about what she had lost, her trust, her sense of security, the life she thought she would have, Emily understood she had also found something precious: resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond with her child. She knew the road ahead would not always be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. As she gazed down at her sleeping baby, Emily whispered a vow to herself and her child: to live fully, to love fiercely, and to never let fear define them again. In that quiet room, surrounded by light and love, a new chapter began, one of healing, strength, and unshakable hope. Life was settling into a fragile rhythm for Emily. Days filled with baby's laughter, therapy sessions, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Yet, beneath the calm, a shadow lingered, a whisper of unease she couldn't shake. One afternoon, as Emily checked the mailbox, she noticed an unmarked envelope resting among the usual bills and flyers. No return address, no indication of who sent it. Her heart skipped a beat. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, taken from a distance. The image showed her home, but more chilling was what was captured in the foreground: her baby, asleep in his crib, visible through the window. A cold wave of fear crashed over Emily. How had someone gotten so close without her knowing? How had they taken this picture without being seen? Daniel was behind bars, but the letter suggested a deeper threat. Had he left someone else watching? Was there an accomplice still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You're not as safe as you think." Emily's instincts screamed danger, but she refused to let fear control her life again. Instead, she felt a fierce determination rising within her to uncover the truth, protect her child, and face whatever darkness lay ahead. The past had taught her one thing: nothing is ever truly over. As night fell, Emily stared out the window, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand, wondering what new chapter was about to unfold.